everyone. Thank you for inviting me here. Thank you, Nahum, for your comprehensive review. I have so much to say about differential budgeting, and I tried to talk briefly and to only touch upon the points that I found most interesting and to perhaps shed light on the complexity of things because it's not all as simple as my friend Nahum showed. Since I wanted to talk about a few points, I'm sorry if I speak a bit in a bit of an associated fashion. So let's begin with the beginning and perhaps also the ending sentence Nahum gave, which is nobody wants equality and that there is no differentiality in the system. I would maintain the opposite is true because if we look deeply into the data of the Ministry of Education, and I will say something that is a bit cynical, so if you don't know me, please don't interpret this any other way. Without Arabs, we would be in a great place. Because if you were to look at the budgeting, you would see that the weak Jew and the strong Jew have a pretty remarkable differentiality between them, 53%, whereas the gaps between Jews and Arabs are huge. And this is true for elementary school, it's true for junior high schools. I didn't show you the slide, but these slides are available on the Ministry of Education website, and also in high schools. And therefore, I don't want to expand and elaborate here on the reasons, but that is the reason for the inequality in budgeting, and that's why I don't accept this statement that nobody wants equality, because the system knows how to help some of the weak populations, not all of them, and that's the problem. The problem with budgeting the Arab sector is present in all the budgeting channels in Israel, not only in the education system. And I'm saying this very unfortunately, of course. It happens in education, in welfare, in employment, in transportation. In any budgeting channel you look at, you will see pretty much the same picture. And the reasons are sometimes similar and sometimes different. We hope sincerely that tomorrow the government will approve this the proposal to repair these, and we have been working in recent years across the board, whether with government resolutions or by discussing together with the different ministries and the representatives of the Arab sector, the Arab ministers, members of Knesset, in order to correct these gaps. But that is the reason for the averages that we are seeing. Another important point, the budgeting data you see are all correct for 2014, which is prior to the program I will be talking about now, and that'll be the Piron system. So all the data you have seen is before the implementation of this program. This program is now in its second year of implementation, second out of 5. This kind of program has to be gradual, and the Ministry of Education data, unfortunately, is only published 18 or 24 months later, and therefore you can't see the impact of this new plan on the budgeting. When we built the new budgeting model, the main thing that guided us was to get to the finish line. Because with all due respect to the Shoshani committee, the wonderful people that were members, they did not get to the finish line. And there are many reasons why this didn't happen. There were all sorts of budget cuts, there were all sorts of objections, but at the end of the day, they didn't finish. Also, there was the High Court of Justice. But either way, they didn't finish, and that's what we looked at first and foremost, because we thought that there's always there's seems to be a tendency when committees are set up and when new models are written to focus on the most accurate theoretical model and to forget that in the system there are all sorts of pressures at play. There is a certain structure of the system, and you can't always object to this structure. Writing a utopian report is important because you have somewhere to strive for, but we can't ignore the system and reality, and we need to internalize these constraints and we need to put them into the model. We don't want an optimistic report, a utopian report that will be destined to stay in our desk drawer, and so we decided to sacrifice what was maybe right on paper in favor of what will be best implemented, more quickly implemented, and will raise less objection. And we did it because we thought that even if we build a model that is 50, 60, 70% optimal, it is still better than 100% optimal that is never implemented. We have to remember that in Israel, governments change every few years, and even if a minister is supportive at a certain time, and right now the conditions are ripe, perhaps next time the minister won't be so supportive, and therefore we need to minimize friction that will enable a long-term and continuing change. And therefore we decided not to sanctify the report. Perhaps if we would try to reverse engineer this report and to try and see what the success would be like, we would have been more successful, but perhaps we won't be. So we tried to examine ourselves according to various parameters. We kept taking one parameter, whether it would be right to budget per classroom or per child. Should we create this differentiality or this differentiality? And we asked ourselves, what is the extent of the contribution of the differentiality of each one of these variables, how implementable it is, how quick it will be, and whether it will be objected to. And if we got too many no's, then we would decide that would be wrong. And this question of classroom versus child, this came up from the audience. Will this variable contribute to differentiality? Of course. Is it the only variable that contributes to differentiality? No. Is it implementable? Not clear. What will happen in a small community that is a strong community and the number of hours per child is not enough to fill the timetable, which is a standard timetable that we want each child to study according to? And we also have a public system. We sanctify the publicity, we sanctify the state run schools. We want it to be everywhere, a public education. And the government also wants to support certain communities in the periphery, let's say Metula up north. So what are we going to do with this school that doesn't reach the minimum? Maybe they don't have enough students, and what if we don't have more people in Metula with children? We need a safety net for them, right? Because it's impossible to have those children not study the minimal curriculum, right? So once we start with safety nets, we get in trouble. Why? Because when we look retrospectively by the allocation per child in Metula, we'll see that this child gets more than a child in Tel Aviv, even though the socioeconomic levels are identical. So our ability to understand exactly why this child got this and this child got that becomes more complex. Another difficulty with implementing the Shoshani method was this massive engagement in safety nets. What if we decide that this school doesn't get a safety net and now has to close down? Of course, this have huge budgetary effectiveness, because there's more than this, just differentiality in play. You also want to be effective. But they came and said to us, and we thought it was true, that this local authority and those teachers will demonstrate outside the Minister of Education's house and the Minister of Finance's house, why are you closing down our school? And that will create friction. Will this friction perhaps lead, during this minister's term in office, maybe he'll be more resilient, but what will happen with the next minister or the one after that? Will they be resilient enough? Will they agree to close a school because the budgeting per child system didn't work? So that's just one of the deliberations, or some of the deliberations that we discussed. And finally, we decided that since we will be complementing the classroom budget anyway, then we might as well not budget each child and have safety nets, because what it means is to have basic classroom budgeting. So that's it about this decision and what guided us. So what we decided to do in junior high schools and in elementary schools, we decided to focus there and not to go to high schools and kindergartens, because the conditions were ripe there more. We had more reports on these age groups. We knew what to do. We've had experience. And this is 9 out of 12 school years, and it's easier and quicker to change the budgeting method there. Of course, it's just a start, and we need the change to be implemented also in the other age groups. As for the local authorities and their contribution, yes or no to regressiveness or differentiality, I don't think that saying that the authorities themselves create differentiality in their own areas, like Tel Aviv prefers the south to the north, is enough, because perhaps Tel Aviv really works very differentially, but some heterogeneous local authorities do not operate this way, such as Jerusalem. And aside from that, there are many local authorities that are homogeneous. I'm not sure that the peripheries and the ultra Orthodox and Arab communities can be differential, and also the weaker local authorities have huge welfare spending, and the gaps between welfare spendings between various local authorities are huge. In clusters 1 to 2, 27% of the population is considered welfare, whereas in 9, 10 clusters it's just 9% on average, and the welfare spending is still the same. Also, the gaps in income between the stronger and weaker local authorities are huge and ever increasing. So I divided the clusters into three: weak, in between, and high. And this is the flexible area. And this is the budget of the local authorities. This is the income of the weak authorities. This is how high it goes. This is the purple is the weak, the red is the medium, and the yellow is the um, strong. And you see huge gaps, almost 3 times higher. And you can also see that growth or increase in the local authorities' income has was higher than in the weaker local authorities, and so the gaps are ever increasing, and we need to think about that as well. A little bit about input and output. When we talk about differential budgeting, we usually talk about the input, and in many cases, certainly in education, input is not even a necessary condition for improving. Look at what happened to the education budget in Israel compared to the OECD countries. This is the total change in spending. The blue is Israel, the red is the average OECD, and this is the growth per student. So you can see that Israel grew in real terms, in nominal terms, per child. And even though we have greater natural growth than in the OECD countries, which means that their budget per child rises without them doing anything because there are less children in the system each year, and yet our budget has grown. And having said that, there's also a test. There's also evidence of improvement. But when you look at us around the world in terms of output, we haven't moved much, especially in light of all the resources invested. In fact, the budget doubled itself over the last decade. No other budget has doubled itself over the last decade. Is this per child? No, no, it didn't double per child, but you can see that also per child, even per student, there is a 38% increase between 2012 and 2015. That's almost the highest rise in OECD countries. And our relative position hasn't changed much. Also, the variance or the distribution of the achievements, which is an indication of inequality, we are the country that has the highest variance, which means we are the worst among OECD countries in gaps. I'm saying all of this because at the end of the day, what's important when it comes to closing gaps is to improve achievements and to close the gaps in output and not in input. I think that we are trying to make things easier for ourselves when we talk about budgeting. It's much easier. It's much easier to examine it, to find the data, the statistics. It's quite but we can't stop talking about results because we see that the gaps in Israel are the highest and they need to change due to budgeting. And therefore, our main mission or main task at hand in the next few years is to make sure that outcomes are improved. We have added millions to weaker schools, and if that doesn't make any that doesn't give us any result, I'm not going to be happy with differential budgeting. If we don't close the gaps, it will just be amount to a waste of money. Just a few last questions that I don't really have an answer for, but I find them very interesting. I think the answers are perhaps mostly value based and not really black and white. But given the resource constraint, and there is a resource constraint, if we want to create very significant differentiality, some of the resources have to come at the expense of those who are stronger. And in such a case, beyond, I mean, the first question already arises, should we do things at the expense of the stronger? But the more significant question is, should we allow the stronger parents to make up the resources taken away? And if not, should we justify the fact that a government will not allow a parent to give their child a certain level of education? Should we suffice with differential government budgeting, or are we looking at the final outcome and not allowing stronger parents that we are harming their budgeting standardization? We will force them to study in classrooms of 40 children, or to allow them to pay the money in order to make the average classroom just comprised of 32 children. In the education of 3 to 4-year-olds that we talked about and Nahum talked about before, this is a regressive move without a doubt, because most of the weak populations have gotten free education at the ages of 3 and 4 even before this reform. So perhaps we should also lower the cost of living for the middle class. Perhaps we should respond to a social protest when 1 million people go out onto the streets. And if it weren't for a constraint, resource constraint, then we would have improved the standard for the poor, but also make free education for 3 to 4-year-olds for everyone. So is this the right thing to do? And another thing, due to this 3 to 4-year-olds of free education, now there's the second aid reform, and because of this reform, for 20 years they had this free education for 3 to 4-year-olds in the periphery, and nobody said a word. And now suddenly, when it started happening in Tel Aviv, then suddenly Tel Aviv started saying they need another aid. And as Nahum said, universality versus differentiality, is it good, is it bad? Is it not right to have the weaker budgeted as the same as the rich, because the affluent keep pulling the standard upwards? And it's true, it doesn't create differential budgeting because everyone gets something quite similar at the end of the day. But if, due to this, the weaker get an addition that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise, then perhaps this marginal addition won't have more of an impact on their achievement, and therefore the gaps won't be closed in the outcome level. I don't know how to answer this, but it's an interesting question. Thank you very much.